Thank you. Kia ora koutou, ko Rebecca Priestley toku ingoa kei te herenga waka aho e mahi ana. I'm Rebecca Priestley. I'm from the Centre for Science and Society at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. So before I introduce our three speakers, I just want to acknowledge Geoff Park. So he's the author of Ngā Uruora, which is one of the books we're going to be talking about today. So Geoff worked as an ecologist with the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research and then at Te Papa before branching out as an independent ecologist and writer. Ngā Uruora was first published in 1995 and has recently been re-released as a VUP classic, so that's this edition here. We're going to talk about the impact of the book today, but just briefly, as well as being a really beautiful and engaging read, it really focused attention on the lowland forests of Aotearoa, the coastal floodplains that we often forget about in favour of what I'm going to call our charismatic mega landforms, the maunga and the highlands. Ingrid Horrocks is Associate Professor at Massey University, where she teaches creative writing. She's the author of a number of books which often return to concerns of mobility, environment and place. In 2014, she co-edited a collection of essays, Extraordinary Anywhere, Essays on Place from Aotearoa, New Zealand. She has an essay in the new BWB collection, Living with the Climate Crisis. And her latest book, the wonderful Where We Swim, just published by VUP this year and coming out in Australia in July, is described in one review as beautiful, surprising, mysterious, deep and reflective. The book takes place in a world experiencing ecological damage and global upheaval, but it's also a world in which we hang out with our kids and go to the beach. Tim Park is the youngest of Geoff Park's 4 children. He trained in ecology and he spent his working life focusing on working out how to manage threats to nature and water by actively protecting and restoring it across the motu. For the last 8 years, he's worked for Wellington City Council, where he's been involved in setting up projects such as Predator-Free Wellington and Conservation Volunteers, and his current role is a manager at Ōtari Wiltons Bosch, and you took us for a bit of a walk up there when I was up there for a hui recently, so it's a great place for a hui. And then Turi Park, the eldest of Geoff Park's 4 children, has a background as a designer and an artist, and his paintings have been described as large, layered and elusive, exploring the darkened fringes of our remaining forests. But he's also got a science connection, and he works as brand strategist for Callaghan Innovation in Lower Hutt, an organisation named after Paul Callaghan and charged with encouraging and enabling innovation across the country to try and make New Zealand a place where talent wants to live. And he's also responsible for the beautiful design of this book, the cover and the inside pages too. So in this session, we're just going to kick things off by a few short readings, and then I will start a conversation by asking some questions, and after that there'll be a chance for a few questions from the audience, so have a think about that and get your questions ready, and then we'll wrap things up with another couple of short readings. So let's get started with some readings, and I think we're going to bring a mic over, a mic stand, so you can hold on to your reading. So we're going to start with Turi, who's going to share something from the beginning of the book.
Kia ora koutou. I'm going to read the intro in 2 parts. There's a dedication and then an intro quote, which was also used for Michael King's Penguin History of New Zealand. And both of these certainly lay down a challenge, and hopefully you'll see that, or hear that. So the dedication: to my children, and those that will find the generosity of spirit that nature in the 21st century will need from us. And then on to the intro quote that we used on this new edition. New Zealand's fertile plains were the last that Europeans found before the Earth's supply revealed itself as finite. Essentially, this was a second Eden. Our relationship with them has been completely unsustainable. We have exploited these islands' richest ecosystems with all the violence that modern science and technology could summon. We must live with the rest of nature or die with the rest of nature. He goes on. If the last survivors of Ngā Uruora are to become part of the quest for more sustainable ways with the land, the vital part that Māori played in keeping them alive last century will have to become central once again to their care.
Yeah, that actually reminded me a bit of the new series on RNZ that just started yesterday. Has anyone seen that? The Fight for the Wild? It's worth finding on RNZ. It's a TV and podcast series. But it talks about that sort of loss that Turi kind of spiked us all with just then. So I'm talking more about, this is actually Dad's, what he called his favourite bit of his own writing. So it's about, it's good to know that he valued this kind of experience. And I think this is something that you drew on also in your book. It's down in the Whanganui Inlet. First thing in the morning, autumn's light just touching the tips of the forest, the serenity of the bay. To a city dweller is unforgettable. Only the canoe wake betrays the stillness, in the illusion that the big trees are keeping their distance. Ashore, a heron breakfasts along a band of raupo. In front of them, wishes I would keep mine. Stepping into a run and flexing its wings in a great downward arc, it sweeps noisily over the calm water. There is enough anxiety in the erection of a kiraru to decide on its leaving. The flash of its white underbelly in the sun, like a signal that there's an intruder about. The low-lying country that fraternises with estuaries and tidal inlets has long been the receiving end of humanity's fondness for wiping out nature. It has shaped a nation of coast dwellers. It has become one of New Zealand's most altered environments. Its indigenous life is dying faster than most, and has become the most easily forgotten. And if ecology tells us anything, what's more, the signs that is worse is yet to come. The brute facts of our contaminating and annihilating every place like it, our reluctance to let other species be, are what makes this little bay such a novel experience. Once before we brought our farms and towns to bear on this kind of ground, there must have been countless like it all around the New Zealand coast. Had Europeans settled New Zealand in less of a rush and with less anticipation of a low-lying country spread awaiting them, a few more forests of big trees might still stand on its tidal flats. For all they evoke the presence of the past, the tall trees are unassuming. Kakatea, rata, pukatea, loaded with shiny flaxen clumps of epiphytes, they appear to stand at the water's edge. But like the same pattern of plants that Petone had, momentarily, had the New Zealand company believing that their desperate search for a great alluvial plain was over. It's an illusion. At Petone, the low line of forest that seemed to come down to the harbour's edge turned out to be behind an invisible belt of swamps and hollows, just as unapparent from out on the water, the bands of manuka scrub and sun-bleached raupo, rushes in front of these big trees are actually broader than the trees are tall. Spread between the tide, the trees is a diversity of life we've made a rarity. Sea rushes lap up the sea at one end, shaded palms and delicate ferns beneath the other, and in between a succession of plants, each progressively less salt-tolerant. Yet unless the quirks of ecology or the search for level land attracted your gaze, you might notice none of it. The meeting grounds of forest and sea are always fascinating places, yet few have this diversity of life. Ecologists talk of such places as communities, but any sense of a co-evolved alliance between its plants is more illusory than real. Just another fantasy, acted out by nature, forced upon us by our urge to divide and classify. As easily as our eyes pick out the concentrations of colour and texture, we are tempted to see zones and boundaries, as if, to be able to inhabit them, the plants of places like this must organise themselves into something like societies. But the lives of this place are no more than cohabitants, sharing affinity for the edges of tidal inlets. What seems like coordination, a design, a special natural system to keep the seed from the trees is revealed on close investigation to be just a collection of plants, thrown together by fate in their ancient histories. Each Darwinian species preoccupied by itself, elbowing its neighbours and sending its seeds to strive at the limits of their abilities.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for coming in the rain, and thanks to the library for hosting us and Rebecca for organising. And it's a pleasure to be on the panel with the two of you. So Ngā Uruora, I got obsessed with it, I guess about 6 or 7 years ago, and I think one of the things that really captivated me about it was this image of Geoff in the canoe, descending into the land, which is the kind of core structuring device in that piece. So I think, I'm not sure that I quite realised at the time, but in a way that was quite influential on my idea and where we swim, of using just my body essentially as the vehicle for trying to engage with the land, but also with society and lots of different kinds of experiences. So I'm just going to read a short section from near the beginning of the book, where I started off this project actually in direct imitation of Geoff Park, but I'm not an ecologist, so I didn't have some of the tools. But I went to Mokau and I swam in the estuary, and it's part of a drive I was doing. So I'm starting there, and then, yeah, I know. It was not a very good idea in many ways. So we just kind of go through the kind of thinking of that. It was early autumn 2017, and I was swimming my way from Wellington to Auckland. I'd taken a long weekend, fitted between teaching classes, to drive north and swim alone in as many places as I could along the way. As a swimmer, I have few aspirations to mastery, but I've always loved being in the water, baths included. In setting out, I wanted to know what that was about. I'd wanted to remember why it was we swam in the first place, and to remember the pleasure of immersing in an element other than air. The year 2017 was also when everyone seemed to start using the word swimmable. Which of our rivers and lakes were swimmable? How many of our beaches, which weren't? Where would the water make us and our children and our parents sick? My impulse to swim in as many places as I could had been prompted, in part, by playing with the new website, Can I Swim Here? Before I set out, I'd printed out water quality maps on which rivers that were rated excellent or good appeared in blue and green, merging into the paper landscapes. They were the colours of water. They were the fantasy tones of childhood and tourism campaigns. But in many areas, especially the rural ones, the yellow, orange and red of fair or poor water quality threaded out from the map's mountain centres like cancer cells, darkening as the waters dropped from the hills and began their journeys through human and farm animal country to the sea. I hadn't looked at the maps closely before planning my route, although I had been reading Geoff Park. I planned mainly based on scenic photographs. I only began to study the maps along the way, and by the time I swam at Mokau on the Upper Taranaki Bight, I knew the river's Waikato catchment was home to 440,000 sheep, 70,000 beef cattle, and 20,000 dairy cattle. The whole length of the river threaded its way across the maps in blood red, not even getting a blue mountain moment at its source. My determination to swim anyway was partly a denial of those water quality figures being the final word, a refusal to let that be how it would be, even here, in this country, the water already too polluted to bother. It was a refusal to accept and simply stay home on dry land. But perhaps it was also an attempt to understand those figures better, to translate backwards from abstractions such as counting rivers by length or by swimmability, an attempt to put my whole body into it. Perhaps it could serve as some form of animal engagement and involvement, of necessary immersion. What were those numbers really telling us? Or, more properly, maybe, what were the waters saying? Perhaps I wanted to feel what it meant to swim so that I could imagine what was at stake in a place becoming unswimmable, for other creatures too, who also need water to live. A day after swimming at Mokau, I developed a urinary tract infection. The source of the infection could have been almost anywhere in the regions I'd swum, at least in the rivers and smaller lakes. It could also have been from too much time in clammy togs. Even if not directly attributable, it felt like my body's physical response to the toxic water in some of the places I'd chosen to swim. My estuary swim wasn't what I'd planned or imagined, but it did help me understand. The numbers were serious. The water was too.
Thank you all for those readings. Ingrid, I just want to start just by riffing off something you said. You said, I'm not an ecologist. You've got a PhD in English literature, I think. But you've paid a lot of attention to place in this book, whether you're on the beach here in Wellington somewhere or in the Amazon jungle or the deserts of Arizona. So there's lots of different landscapes and ecosystem. And I wondered if this focus on place, on landscape, is something that you grew up with as well in some way, or if it's something that you came to as an adult.
Yeah, it's a good question. My mum and dad just back there. My parents were environmental campaigners, so that was part of what I grew up with. But actually, I think that it's probably moving to the country was what was decisive. So they kind of returned to the land, turned into a sheep farm in the Wairarapa, which is not very ecologically sound, but nonetheless leads to a very kind of quite a lonely teenagehood and a lot of walking around on hills and thinking about that kind of thing. But I think like many of us, then you end up with a very urban 20s. And so I think it's been, for me, it's a kind of return to thinking about place and landscape. And also, I think in the last few years, that sense that I'm not an ecologist and I don't have those tools, but nonetheless I want to think about these things and that they are part of my life and that they're not separate from these urban lives that we live. It's actually the beach and what happens in our footpaths and the waters that are underneath the city. They're just feeling like it just was central. So, yeah, it kind of came to the fore. And that it's not some people's job. I think that's the shift for me. That it's not these guys' job to think about that. It's probably all of our jobs to think about that.
Yeah, I'd agree, I think. Is this fun going? In a way, we're all ecologists. We're all trying to figure it out, what our place is in the world and how we can interact with it and what it all means and how it's connected and how we can share in it and enjoy it and look after it. So I think that's part of it too. We kind of, the scientific way really separates us from nature, but that's not right. We are part of nature. And it's going to take us a long time to unpack that as a species, and we're still trying to do that, I think, around the whole climate change situation we've found ourselves in.
Yeah. So you are an ecologist, and I'm just wondering to what extent your father's work and this book kind of was foundational for you in the work that you do now. Or was it something that you tried not to do?
Oh, I definitely did it. Well, to be honest, like when I was a teenager, I had a good think about. Went off the rails a little bit there for a while, and luckily I got back on them. I had to think about what I wanted my life to be really, and had to think about what. Our parents had done for us and how we grew up. And thought Dad's got it pretty sweet as an ecologist. Maybe I should just do that because I understand that and it makes sense to me. It was kind of all around me. And I'm not sure if Ngā Uruora was... I think in the family it was more of a relief that it was done, really, after many Fergus is laughing, after many years of lots of printouts of copies and things. But I think, I think Mum and Dad's passion for nature and because Mum's an ecologist too, as well as being an artist and an amazing person. So she, together they really supported us to do what we wanted to do. And I think we're really, and for me that was looking after and understanding nature, really. Yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah, I have to second that, and I also have to sort of get clear right up front that we are all ecologists. Sorry, folks. ecology is the science of relationships, and it starts there really. So what sort of relationship do we want to have with the water? What sort of relationship do we want to have with each other and with the trees? It's pretty simple. And I remember that sort of moment of clarity that Dad had, that sort of Pākehā were essentially protecting natural areas so that we could look at them, whereas Māori were of these natural areas and wanted to be in them. And this is why I'm so interested about being here today with Ingrid and her thoughts, because the only answer is to swim in the stuff. It's that simple.
Thank you. And Turi, I was just thinking, when we were exchanging emails before this event, you wrote this about your dad. You said he dived so deep into botany that it became ecology, and he kept going with ecology until it became mātauranga Māori. And I wondered, how important or relevant is this sort of transdisciplinary approach today, particularly with regard to the sort of work that you do?
It's, as Dad sort of figured out and spent his life trying to teach us, it's the only way forward, and that's essentially what he's saying in that intro that I read out first. If we take from these rivers, if we take from this water, if we take from this world, we're just taking from ourselves, we're taking from our kids. And again, it's as complex as you like it, but it's as simple as you like it as well.
Also, I wanted to ask, you've briefly talked about it, but you kids don't really appear in this book. You're not characters in the book, but I imagine that you were very much aware of what was going on, and I think you said you swam it and you lived it. Can you talk a bit about what it was like being part of that family while the book was being researched and written?
Yeah, okay, so number one, I need to honour Mum, who's here as well, my mother Lindsay. Our childhood was a whole lot of mucking around in nature. We had a series of Toyota Hiace vans with a platform in the back, which you couldn't do these days, and sort of 6 of us would jump in there and hoon off, and we'd have fish and chips for dinner, and we'd park up and crash the night somewhere at some lowland ecological point.
I got to sit across the front seats.
So we learnt by complete absorption, if you like, and then when it came to Dad figuring out the storytelling part of his career, that complete absorption just continued, and he treated us like sort of external RAM on his computer and would test all these ideas. We were the conversation that kind of extended from him talking to himself, and he winnowed these things down. He'd go like that, and that's how he sort of got his ideas, and Fergus saw that up close. So yeah, it was awesome. It was beautiful. It was wonderful. It was highly frustrating, but it was brilliant. But we were swimming it. Yeah, go on.
And Tim, do you have anything to add to that?
I was a bit younger than Turi, so I was kind of more like, I remember the wet socks and the silt between my toes, and our dog chasing possums, and basically getting them by the neck, and it's been great fun, but not because it's killing, but it's more like it was just like our way of experiencing this kind of the nature and being there and Dad exploring those places was kind of, it was both experiential but also deep into research about all of the other people who had come before and all the archival stuff that he crawled through meticulously to build Ngā Uruora, really.
So Ingrid, I've just got a vision of your 2 daughters here on a panel in, 20 years' time, whatever. Your family is very much a part of your book, and I wondered if that was what you set out to do, or if that's just how things evolved.
Yeah, that was my vision just then, and how weird that would be. Yeah, so my daughters Lena and Natasha, very much part of the book, and that wasn't part of the original vision when I set off on this first journey, but it was part of the problem that I saw and what I was writing. So, you know, I've got these two children. That's a lot of my life, and it's an important part of my life. And then I kept finding that when I wrote, what I did was I drove away from my family, and I wrote these things about the solitary woman in the landscape doing this stuff. And it just felt like, for me, it wasn't the story that I wanted to tell. And I think probably that's also a shift from the 1990s to now. I think a lot of what could be called nature writing is trying to work out how you kind of embed the collective in that. And I kind of didn't really want to write the solo human subject either. I didn't want myself to be the hero, so I wanted to be messier. So my children and my brothers and my parents in there, and everyone is talking to me, and there's interlocutors, and my kids ask me questions. And yeah, it was partly bringing pleasure in, but it was kind of bringing all life in, which also was one of the things that it also helped to bring nature into everything. So there's a lot of walking from my house by the zoo to Princess Bay on the south coast. That's our ecological journey, and that's where we look at the world. And just in terms of how the book's been received, one of the things that's really nice is that reviewers seem to see the children as bringing joy to the book, so that's kind of been interesting for me, and levity, because sometimes, as our 3 opening readings showed, it can be pretty dire stuff. So sort of actually deliberately bringing them in was part of the project. Once I worked that out.
Just building on that, I think that unfortunately we have relied on loss to talk about nature a lot, and that's really sad. Talk about the love and loss.
Yeah, that there is actually the reason we put a quote from our grandma in there, Dad's mum, and she had this old English sort of thing that rolled around in her head, and she rolled it to us, was where there's hope, there's life. And again, it's a huge idea, but it's also very simple. Yeah.
Can I just respond to that idea about how to find that hope? And one of the things that really struck me when I went back to look at Ngā Uruora was the memory of how it's structured. So it's very carefully structured. So it starts with 2 landscapes of loss and ruination, and then it shifts to the landscapes that have some kind of hope. And so although it is a terrible story, it's also the story that's structured so that you can imagine how it could be differently done in the future. Yeah, and I was quite moved actually to go back and remember that.
Yeah, and you know, at the heart of a lot of these regeneration projects or fixing projects, once you get that balance back, or once you get those conditions for the right growth back, and the poison's away, the growth happens quickly, and that hope grows really quickly. So that's the cool thing.
And just grounding it back. Cool. Just grounding that here in Wellington. Is that okay? Oh. Just grounding that in that sort of hope in Wellington. We've seen a remarkable transformation of our ecosystems here in Wellington locally through people with hope and through people with love of these local landscapes, and huge amount of work by lots of committed locals to restore nature locally because of their knowledge and care for these places. So it is possible, and essentially that's what's happening with a lot of the work that Council's supporting in Wellington is getting these trees, landscapes back into these forested landscapes to help the streams be clear again so we can swim in the harbour without worrying about it. But also the predator-free stuff that's inspiring people that we can do this together collectively, that we can glow this up and make it work. And kaka, kireru, tui are coming back. You know, the fish are coming back to our streams because it's okay now. And effectively we are kind of seeing that hope realised locally here in Wellington, and I think we can be really great advocates for that elsewhere in New Zealand, because we've all need to be advocates beyond this place. Yeah.
And one of those great places of hope and a bit of a sanctuary is Tari, where you work. And so what has it been like to really be embedded in one place and focus all your attentions in one place like that?
That's great. I love Otari, and it is pretty busy though. Like, it's actually a really social place, which is nice. And a lot of people go there for just getting away from it all, but for me, it's actually nice connecting with people that also love it. And want to be there and choose to be there. Lots of the team has been there for a really long time, so that says something. Hopefully I can hold on to them. But it's really great just having the opportunity, because I see Otari as a place to inspire restoration and to talk about what is possible in terms of ecological restoration. It's the best bit of forest in Wellington that was left. And we've actually looked after it pretty well, considering what we knew and what resources we had, as well as being the home for over 1,000 native plant species from all over the Motu. So not just from Wellington. It's like a living museum, really. But the forest itself, it's a big part of the 2% of the forest that remains in Wellington, of old growth forest. So it's a tiny little, in a way, there's an analogy which talks about ecosystems, or in this case forest, being like a cloak or a carpet. And if you cut up that carpet or into lots of little pieces, all you really have is strands of wool or little fragments. That can kind of give you a clue as to what that blanket looked like when it was entire. But it is really just a fragment that we're trying to, and I'm trying to get the most out of those fibres really of the carpet, and making sure they're inspirational as they can be for us to basically reweave that cloak for Wellington. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to open up for some audience questions in a minute, so maybe if you could get your questions ready and we could have a mic ready for that. But Ingrid, I just wanted to, take things down a bit and talk about climate change after all that hope. Your book, it's not a book about climate change, but with its themes of ecology and pollution and family, how much is climate change kind of there with you while you're experiencing this and writing about it?
That's a really interesting question because it's an evolving one, I think. So when I went back to my first chapter, what became the first chapter, which is 2017, there seemed to be something a little bit quaint about worrying about waterways. And I know it's not quaint, and it is actually where the work happens, but there was something that I was just worried about waterways, and there wasn't as much of a presence of climate change. And I just, over the period of writing the book, that sense that it's absolutely come into the foreground. So by the end of that book, it's, the student strikes and actually me trying to consider what it means that, as I said, my parents were environmental activists, and that was seen as, that was important to me, but it wasn't my life. I went off and did other things. And that sense of coming back and thinking, actually, that was pretty important 20 years, and maybe we need to actually focus on this now. So in a way, it's part of the story for me of a shift in the book. Also, the book sort of very irresponsibly travels the world. So we go to the Amazon and Arizona, and everywhere we went, I feel as though you just kind of have a general conversation, and people say, the river's changing, there's no more snow, just that sense that things changing. And just one other thing, I think once I started thinking, this is partly about climate change, then it also became about trying to do that reimagining of how we're going to engage with the world, in which the humans are not the most important thing, and timescales are different, and how do we write rocks, and how do we write animals, and if their narratives are as important as our narratives, what does that mean about how I write that encounter with an elk or a whale, or So it sort of got into the prose, I think, rather than into the content early on. It really sort of started changing how I was structuring my sentences, which is quite bleak in terms of content, but it was quite exciting as a writer to start thinking, yeah, how do we adjust?
We've got time for some questions now. Okay, we've got one here.
Thank you. We have a long way back. Would you like to, utilising intent and performance, give us a mark out of 10 for how New Zealand is going at this point? We can take the bad news, give it to us.
I think, in that regard, COVID's fucking brilliant. Sorry for swearing. But we had to really consider exports. We had to look hard at agriculture, but we lost tourism. It's really cool looking at that, working for Callaghan Innovation. The whole point of Callaghan Innovation is to try and be smarter, trying to find smarter ways to earn external revenue that don't hurt the environment. Yeah, I'd say we're buggered, in all honesty, and Dad would say we're buggered. He did say we're buggered. There's definitely still hope, and I'm still hopeful. But what I read out earlier to start with, Dad wrote in the mid-90s. We lost him in 2009. As we got past 2000, he'd be out walking, and one thing he'd definitely say was, "Mate, it's going to be interesting for you guys when I'm gone." And one of the last things he sort of said consciously to me was, "Shit, mate, it's going to be interesting for you guys when I'm gone." And I think that's it there, eh? Like, this subtle thing of things warming up by 2 degrees is going to be bloody freaky. What that's going to mean, what's going to sort of flow out of that, what we're going to lose. The work should have started. Yeah.
Thank you. I take that as a 1.
I'd probably be a bit more generous. I'd probably be like a 3 or a 4. But let's go back to what Turi said earlier about the hope stuff. I think you just got to bloody get on with it. Like, actually, don't wallow in the loss and where we are. We actually have to just pick up a spade or put out that trap and do some work, because in the act of doing it creates positivity and momentum. So I think just, it's pretty cheesy now, but there's from Rio conference, there's the think global, act local, and it's still true today as it was then. Yeah.
I've got thoughts about that, partly in relation to what Rebecca has said about her own writing, that Rebecca's been writing about climate change for a long time, and now everyone's writing about climate change, and that sense of what's the shift. But it still seems to me that a lot of people are writing about climate change, but it doesn't seem like we're doing very much. I know we are making some changes, but it does feel like that idea that we radically need to change our lives, every single one of us. I feel like I can't quite believe we haven't fully got that one now, and it feels like maybe we're going to get it, but it feels like we need to get it pretty fast.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of writing that's sort of climate grief or ecological grief, but we need to get beyond that into some action. And I think it's really worth pointing out that if we do blow through the 1.52 degrees of warming, it's really important that we try not to get to 3 degrees. That's going to be a whole lot worse than 2, etc. So, we can't get too upset when things, aren't quite what we'd hoped. We're not quite where we hoped we might have been. We're just got to keep on going. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
Would you consider that the market forces, that market forces are our elephant in the proverb? We are faced with, as you so rightly put it, remnants, threads, small parcels where the vast majority of the world is under a tsunami of market forces, I would say. How
I
do
don't
you
know what to
go?
say about that, but yes.
Well, is there an elephant in the room?
There's no market without us, is there? We've created the market, and so it's now currently controlling us, not the other way around. That's the problem.
Yeah, and we live in a good country to consider that.
Yeah.
This shift towards a wellbeing budget, and behind that, the Treasury Living Standards Framework, which is essentially proposing a Māori way of looking at this stuff and not a market way of looking at this stuff. Hopefully we can have that conversation loud and soon, because that's the guts of it. So thank you for that question.
Okay, we've got time for one more question if anyone's got a burning question they want to ask. Otherwise, I've got one and I'll carry on. Okay. Well, I just wanted to ask Ingrid, we've been focused on the COVID-19 pandemic over the last year. And when it goes away, as we've been talking about, we've still got climate change to deal with. And I wondered what role you think literature plays in our collective response to climate change.
Yeah, that's always a hard one. Partly because literature, it's hard to make literature feel urgent and fast enough. But I think maybe that's good. It makes yes, we need urgency, but also this is a long game. So thinking about Ngā Uruora as an example. So I probably wouldn't have read a straight ecology text, but something like Geoff Park's book actually provided a bridge for me, and I think for a lot of readers to actually enter and engage with these things. So there's that first person non-fiction narrative which puts a human kind of going through their lives and experiencing things in relation to the world is something that literature can do. I also just think that poetry and fiction can kind of push us sideways and give us spaces to imagine how things could be different. And if we can imagine how things could be different, we can kind of imagine change. And they can tell long stories. So if we can work out how to tell stories that aren't, we used to do the marriage plot. Then Dickens did the city for us, so we kind of knew how the city was connected. If we can work out ways to tell stories that go over long periods of time, so we can see what this climate change thing, which is a global something that's going to happen over a couple of hundred years. Sometimes that means completely imaginary world. Sometimes it means a tilt. Writers can imagine the lives of animals, probably in a different way, but drawing on scientific things. So yeah, I do think it still feels really important to me. I also think we're going to need solace, and I think that's something that literature can give us too. But it can also kind of give us a kick in the pants and say, hey, hang on, let's shift things up.
Thank you. So we're just going to have some last words from each of the panellists here. So Turi, you've got a reading you want to do. Tim, do you want to think about whether you want to share that story that engages with Ingrid's work about your dad's last swim?
Oh, yep.
Yeah? And Ingrid, you've got a reading. So Turi, we'll start with you.
Sorry, I'll just get set up. It's a little bit of a long one. This piece is called Watersheds of the Mind. It's by an Italian writer, and it was a little wee book that Dad was given over lunch by Gary Snyder when they had lunch together at Gary Snyder's home in Kikaditsi in September 2006. I referenced this in a exhibition of paintings that I did called Watershed after Dad died. It was sort of a way for me to explore a whole lot of grief, actually. But anyway, here we go. And I thought today I couldn't not read it, given that's Ingrid's work we're here to talk about. So here we go. The whirling currents, full with rain, let their precious load of water down, renewing models and processes that the land, the mountains, the forests, the rivers and seas have known for thousands of years. Everywhere in the world it is the cycle of water that takes form, that renews itself. The rains fall, percolate through musky soil, high in the mountains, form rivulets, creeks, torrents and finally rivers that wind and flow through rock and trees and tree roots, feeding big and little watersheds. Water gives the earth a common well, so that all living beings can have enough to drink and flourish. The hospitable valleys and the wild and harsh mountains all around our watersheds are the heritage of people and cultures that from much more time than we can imagine lived with the view that without the river and its mosaic of water, their stories, traditions, works, legends, objects, tools, and languages wouldn't have existed. Their history was birthed and informed by changing river courses, animal migrations, seasons changing, and the features of their territory. This is the organic story of all of us who sometimes resurface in the poet's lines, the storyteller's ballads, and through people's common sense. It is in the eye of the old people who couldn't keep themselves from giving daily homage to the river. It was in the eye of the old fisherman that used to come every weekend to my parents' house to sell his fish, and every time before leaving he used to say, "Tomorrow I will drown myself." I was just a child at that time, and we all thought he was joking. But one day, he who knew the river so well, he pushed off and he never came back.
Well, just to continue the somber buzz. In Ingrid's book, Where We Swim, she talks a bit. One of the chapters is kind of exploring her personal relationship with swimming in Days Bay, with her parents and her girls and her partner Tim, not me, and the other Tim. But Dad lived in Days Bay, so I couldn't. When I read Ingrid's book, I couldn't help but draw parallels with my swimming in Days Bay with Dad. And he's. I remember walking down with him, and he was. He could hardly walk, but we swam in the sea, and it was really lovely. But let's remember that sparkling day. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so that was his last one because he couldn't live by himself at that point, and we had to look after him basically in a managed way. Yeah, so that was his I think last dip in the sea, and but it was a lovely place to do it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. In one of the chapters in Where We Swim, I talk about my mother-in-law's kind of the last swim, and it occurs to me that is maybe for New Zealanders, that's one of a kind of a passing, a kind of moment where that's the last time you get to go to the beach and be in the world in that way before the next thing. Yeah.
So Ingrid, will you close things off with a reading from your book?
Yeah, I am, and I don't think it's too bleak, so that's good. So I actually, I can probably just hold it. I think we're all good. So actually, I just thought I'd read the coda. It's just a couple of pages, and I wrote it after. Basically, this is after I finished the book, but it's about a year ago, and it's kind of reminding of where we were a year ago. And it's dated, as some bits of the book are. So, coda, Monday, 20th April, 2020. The book was mostly written. It was about a life that was passing and about unknowable futures. But everything vibrates differently now. 3 weeks after my night swim, so I did a night swim that I thought was the end of the book, and then COVID came, so then I didn't write the book for about another 4 months because I didn't know what to do, but I came back to it. So three weeks after my night swim, both my brothers had to cancel long trips to visit us here in New Zealand. I have no idea when we will see each other. I still don't. Especially Tom in Colombia, who couldn't get here even if he wanted to, and where the situation gets harder every day. And every day this week in particular. We visited my parents the day before things really shut down and travelled together in the same car to walk in the bush, the girls swimming naked in a small stream. We hugged them goodbye and only then let the anxiety nudge its way in about whether we could have infected them. 4 days after that, we were in lockdown. No driving except to the supermarket. where we stood in lines 2 metres apart. No physical interaction with those beyond our household. The girls home with us. We talked about bubbles and small units of 1 to 5 people moving a wary distance from the other bubbles that pass, edging off the footpath onto roads where there are now only a few cars. With borders closed, New Zealand has become a whole new kind of island, in some ways separated off after all. No touching, Auckland unreachable. I may as well be as far from my parents as my brothers are. Their home a short but illegal drive away around the harbour's curled mouth. A few days into the lockdown, we went on a bike ride along the south coast, and when we took a break, Tim and the girls stripped and briefly went into the water in a secluded gap between rocks. We returned home to the headline news story featuring an image of a woman streaming through the water, drops of spray peeling behind her curved arm. Below her was the headline, "No swimming." Only fish and whales swim out there now. Birds swoop without planes in the skies, pumping out their hot paths of breath. On my phone, I look at exponential graphs of viral spread and networks of connection. If her, then her and him, and possibly you. If me, then maybe that other man's mother. The grid lines spread out in tangled tendrils of life and death. We see it, properly, as infection or not. We have this moment, inexplicably terrible and new, to take everything in before we push ourselves out again into the connective, chaotic splendour and danger of this world. We have a breath to reconsider where and with whom and why we swim, and the ways what we do ripple out into the lives of others. If it's a chance to learn again, it's one where we will still carry so many things, including our young on our backs. We know how to float, how to spit out water when it floods our lungs. That there are stages in a human life and in the life of a planet, and that there are choices in what we do. Tuesday, 28 April. We're at the beach before 9, the day swimming begins again. The sun is bright, the sky a perfect pale autumn blue. The waves run in across the stretch of a low tide. They are what Natasha and Lena, my daughters, call ankle waves. We keep careful physical distance from a man carrying a kayak up from the beach. When we wave, he beams at us. It's beautiful out there. We start the long walk into the water. Over the coming days, there are hundreds of us. We walk quietly, distant but connected, feeling the water washing around us, rising from feet to knee to thigh, all of us wanting to find ways to live.
That was a beautiful way to finish, Ingrid. So thank you to all 3 panellists. And just as a last thing, I highly recommend these books to you. They're available here in the library, but they're also lovely books to have if you want to buy a copy. Thank you so much for coming out on this very wet day. Thanks.